So welcome. We are here today to talk about forms changes primarily. So why don't you introduce yourself, Ryan?
Sure. My name's Ryan Torpey. I've been with the association just shy of 2 years, the state association. I am one of two lawyers on staff, and I principally do our forms. I also do our legal hotline, and I do pro standards where I'll administer ethics complaints and ethics hearings and arbitration hearings on behalf of the association.
So you're a busy guy.
Busy guy. Yes,
Well, we're just going to stick to the forms part of your job.
Perfect.
If that's all right. So first, I'd like to just set the ground. Most members probably know every August 1st is our forms change.
That's correct.
So why do we change our forms?
Well, we change our forms on August 1st because the legislative session will have ended, and we want to make sure that any updates legislatively that have been made that require certain statutory mandates for new requirements are implemented in a timely fashion. And we want to make sure that our forms are the most up-to-date and the most refined that they can be. And so, from a realtor's perspective, our forms are a manifestation of a transaction. It's what they do on paper. So it's critical that they're regularly updated, as there are new technologies and new concerns that may come to the surface, that those can be addressed if appropriate, and that they are as polished and as kind of up-to-date as possible.
Okay. Is that primarily your job to review them all and decide what gets changed, or is it a committee thing?
That's a committee thing.
Okay.
So the way it works in general is we've got a forms committee that meets regularly throughout the first half of the year to review changes that have been submitted by our membership. So if you go to Minnesota Realtors website, there is a forms suggested change page where you can go and submit a change, and you have an opportunity to explain why, which form, what part, the reasons behind the change. We compile those changes throughout the year, and then we get our leadership team, the leaders of the forms committee to review those changes prior to the full committee meeting and taking them up for consideration. Okay. So they're vetted at that stage early on. The changes that are passed through are brought to the full committee, and it's always the full committee that will undertake deliberations on the change, talk through concerns, talk through whether the language makes sense, and then we'll take those suggestions back. We'll implement those changes. That's what staff will do. We'll propose language, so on and so forth. And then the committee ultimately will adopt or not the change.
So the committee is realtor members?
Yes.
All realtor members?
Correct.
How big is that committee?
That committee, it's fairly large. So I would say we have about, this is an estimate, about 30 members on our forms committee.
Oh, wow.
And we try to pull from all parts of the state for a variety of reasons, right?
Yeah.
Somebody's transaction experience in the Twin Cities might be very different from rural parts of Minnesota or northern Minnesota. And so we try to pull a wide net so that all those voices can be heard and so that concerns that are relevant throughout the entire state are addressed.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. I know I've seen some discussions over the years in Hot Dish about, why don't we do this? We should all follow this way of doing something. And then someone from, greater Minnesota will kind of pipe in and go, that might work for you guys in the Twin Cities, but that's not really going to work out here, right?
Absolutely.
So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's a good representation.
Yeah.
So I've been in real estate for 20 years, and just about every year there's a good number of forms that get changed. Is that pretty common, or has there ever been a year that you know of where there's really only minimal things to change?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it really depends. I've seen it both ways.
Okay.
So this year, for example, we've got a relatively small number of changes to forms themselves, but some of the changes are substantial.
Sure.
Likewise, we may have, a limited number of changes, but it may involve the creation of a whole new form, which is, to preview a little bit, what we've got this year, right?
Oh, okay.
And that requires a lot of work whenever you're creating a new form. And so there's a lot that goes into, bringing a form to life. But other years you may have a high number of changes, but they're relatively minor, relatively simple.
One little word.
Exactly. Or you may have a change like we did last year to the written statement section of our purchase agreement, which is a hugely important section of the purchase agreement.
That was very impactful.
It was very impactful, exactly. And so sometimes a small change in number can nevertheless create a large kind of response from the realtor community because they understand the significance of the provision at issue.
So how many individual forms are changing this year?
Yeah, roughly 15 forms are changing in terms of tweaks to individual forms. Now that's going to be across a variety of substantive changes where there'll be larger, more impactful changes to certain provisions of those forms. Or it could be a combination of just kind of smaller tweaks throughout, which I'll explain in greater detail. But at the end of the day, all of our forms are changing. We're changing the copyright on our forms, which I'll talk about. So all the forms will be changed in the copyright sense, but I would say in terms of meaningful changes where the form won't look the same, it's going to be about 15 across all of the forms that we provide.
Okay. So what is the copyright change?
Yeah, the copyright change is just a removal of the city from the top right corner of our copyright itself. So before we had, the city Minnetonka. Prior to that, we had Edina. There was questions about which one applies. What if we move again? And so the committee ultimately determined, if it's not necessary, which it's not, let's just remove it so that it's consistent, a little clearer, and removes any kind of questions surrounding that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So of the 15 forms, do you want to talk about any of the major upsets of the forms?
Yeah,
what are the major ones?
I'd be happy to talk you through the big
ones. Yep.
Which involves the creation of a whole new form.
Okay.
So Minnesota Statute 355.155 was amended this year.
Okay.
And that requires that owners of property where chronic wasting disease in cervidae has been detected must make that disclosure. That's a new disclosure for 2023. So I'll back up because I know there'll be questions around that.
That's around deer?
That's correct.
Okay.
Very good. You were ahead of the game. I had no idea.
Chronic waste. That was my key.
I had no idea. So yes, cervidae applies to family of deer. And the legislature decided, so if this is detected, there's environmental concerns, and we want to make sure that owners of property where that exists are making those disclosures to prospective purchasers. That was not a mandated disclosure prior to that. Now, I should back up and mention that this change from a statute perspective is really aimed at deer farms, right? So it will typically not be a surprise for an owner of property to know that chronic wasting disease was detected on the property. They likely will have known and will have been dealing with this for some time because once chronic wasting disease has been detected, that triggers a whole slew of additional obligations and requirements imposed on the property that wasn't there before.
So if I just own acreage, I may not know.
Correct.
Deer hopping through.
Correct.
Okay.
And you'd have to know, right? So if you didn't know,
can't disclose what you don't know.
Exactly. Yep. So if you did have knowledge, there's a number of requirements that are going to be imposed from cooperating with the Department of Animal Health, any other regulatory agency that wants to come in and look into the soil. The owner is going to have to construct fencing. They're going to have to erect biohazard signs around the fencing. They're going to have to get any herds of cervidae tested by an accredited veterinarian every 12 months.
Oh my.
They're going to have to permit cervidae from moving to or from the property. They're going to have to ensure that the animals are properly disposed of, so on and so forth. So there's a whole lot of requirements that are going to be imposed on whoever the owner of that property is. And so we've had to update our purchase agreement first and foremost to ask the question, are you aware whether has chronic wasting disease been detected on the property?
Yep.
If yes, see the brand new form,
disclosure.
new disclosure statement, which is going to walk through a seller all the requirements incumbent on the owner to kind of comply with, and so that a buyer will know what they're getting themselves into. So we've done our best to map the new form onto the statutory requirements. And the form committee, I think, did a really nice job cleaning up the language, making sure that it's intuitive, making sure that it's clear. So it's one more disclosure to keep track of.
Wow.
It is what it is. But we've at least now got the form to accommodate for that change.
it seems to me like this would be more impactful for greater Minnesota.
Absolutely. So remember,
we might not see it so much in the metro area.
Exactly, as we had mentioned earlier, right? It's going to change. So and that was reflected in our forms committee. You could tell the people who are on the committee from Greater Minnesota had a much greater familiarity with chronic wasting disease in the first place than somebody who's in the metro area.
Okay. Well, I mean, SPAR's jurisdiction spans away from the Twin Cities.
Sure.
So this could definitely be very impactful to some of our members.
Absolutely.
Great.
So keep an eye out for this one. It's a big change.
So, and you said there were 2 new forms.
There is.
Okay.
And so, to be precise, there's 3 new forms, one on the residential side, one mirrored on the commercial side. The new form on the residential side will be an addendum or an amendment to a buyer's representation contract, to a listing contract, or to a facilitator services agreement. This is a flexible kind of all-in-one catch-all form that a member can use to adapt the form to their needs. So they just check the box. What is this form going to serve as? Well, it's going to be an addendum to a buyer's representation contract, and then you can fill in the information that's going to amend the form or addend the form, whatever it might be. And then again, it'll apply to a facilitator services agreement. It'll apply to a listing contract. So it's the committee was excited about this opportunity because it's a nice flexible form that can be used in a variety of transactions. And so they like having that there. So the committee felt good about that. So on the commercial side, it's reflected as a buyer representation or listing contract.
Okay.
On the commercial side, so it's just mirrored.
So addendum or amendment to a representation agreement of some sort.
Exactly.
So is that to combat using the addendum or amendment to a purchase agreement?
Exactly.
What they were using it for?
Exactly.
Okay. All right. So now we have 2 sets of kinds of addendums or amendments. All right. Well, that sounds like a good change.
It's
more clean.
It's definitely a cleaner solution.
So some of the, I'm not going to say minor, but some of the less major changes. What do we have going on?
I'll talk through some of the changes that are not as substantial as the new chronic wasting disease disclosure form, for example. And so why don't we just dive into the purchase agreement? These will be the changes to the residential PA, vacant land PA, and the new construction purchase agreements.
Okay.
And so there's a few changes we've made there. The first change we made was we modified the financing section of the purchase agreement, and we've done that in 2 ways. And so first, the word "or" was added in between the 2 checkbox options in the mortgage financing contingency. So we modified the financing contingency in 2 ways in the purchase agreement. First, the word "or" was added in between the 2 checkbox options in the mortgage financing contingency, and we did this for additional clarity. We had received some feedback from members that, some of the members or realtors using our forms were checking both options as opposed to checking one. It's an either-or choice. You are either going to get the financing that you say you're going to get by the time specified in the PA, or you're going to provide a written statement.
Right.
You're not going to do both. Right? And so we just added that word "or" there to just make that extra clear.
Yep. Okay.
Right? The written statement section of the mortgage financing contingency was also changed. And the change we made here specifically was to include the following phrase: an appraisal satisfactory to the lender has been completed, or the lender has waived the appraisal. So we've basically included a phrase to permit a lender to waive the appraisal and for that to comport with the requirements of the written statement section. So now we were getting feedback from our committee that, oftentimes these appraisals are being waived, but the written statement section says that an appraisal has been completed and it's been satisfactorily approved by the lender.
Yeah, there was none.
What do we do there if there's been no appraisal? So we just included that clause there to basically contemplate that possibility. Okay, now we'll move on to the inspection contingency. We've got 2 changes to the inspection contingency. So first, we changed the word "intent" with "election." Okay. And so you might recall that the inspection contingency says that if this purchase agreement is contingent upon inspection, buyer may cancel this purchase agreement based on the inspections or tests by providing written notice to seller or licensee representing or assisting seller of buyer's intent to cancel, so on and so forth. So we replaced "intent" with "election" because that's The Forms Committee believed that that was more clear, and there were circumstances where if somebody provided notice of their intent to cancel, there was a question, so are you canceling?
So are you going
Or are you
yeah.
just giving me your intent to cancel? Because I
can
need
see
a
that.
cancellation. So there was just some
Right.
more confusion. Whereas election, I'm electing to cancel.
I'm canceling. Yes.
It's
You're
clear that
making
the cancellation is
yeah.
moving forward. Okay. Second change to the inspection contingency was the inclusion of the following language. If buyer cancels this purchase agreement, here's the relevant language, then this purchase agreement is canceled. So we included that additional provision to ensure that the purchase agreement cancels by its own terms. Now that phrase is elsewhere in the purchase agreement when it specifies that the PA is canceled. And this addition is really for statutory cancellation purposes because you've got language in there specifying that if the purchase agreement is canceled, then it's canceled.
Right.
Best practice always to obtain a signed cancellation regardless of that.
Right.
But this language helps to ensure that the buyer's equitable interest in the property is severed when a cancellation is served through the inspection
Through the
contingency.
Time. Yep.
Also, as I briefly mentioned before, we did add the question on the purchase agreement whether chronic wasting disease has been detected on the property to prompt somebody to rely on the appropriate disclosure
Right.
form. And those would be all the changes for the residential purchase agreements.
Okay. Good ones. Very good ones. Very minor, but definitely clarifies some things. So not too drastic here.
Absolutely. So I'll talk about changes to our residential lease agreement, where those changes are the result of some legislative changes that were pushed through. And so Minnesota statutes, chapter 504B of the Minnesota statutes were amended, which required certain changes be made to our residential lease to comply with the requirements of the amended statute. And so on the first page of our residential lease, a line was added for a non-optional fee disclosure and for a reoccurring non-optional fee disclosure. So the legislature said, listen, when somebody's moving in and they're relying on a lease, we want to see what kind of fees are non-optional. They must be paid, right? So that they're not hidden. We want a little more transparency there. And it could be a number of things. It could be a move-in fee. It could be a pet fee. It could be a public Wi-Fi access fee, whatever it might be. Those fees need to be specified on the first page of the lease. So we've provided those spaces. Our Forms Committee smartly, I think, took that an additional step to distinguish between fees that you pay one time and you're done, and then fees that are continuing to occur throughout your lease, right? And so those are distinguished, but they're both there, so you can fill those in.
Reminds me when the closing disclosure statements changed, how much more clear they were on that page of this is what you're paying, this is what you're going to keep paying, this is what. So yeah, I can see why this kind of came about.
Yeah, absolutely. In addition, we've added a total monthly payment line that will incorporate the non-optional fees, reoccurring or not, and incorporate that into what the total monthly fee is going to be. And that's a change required by the legislature, so that's clear. So it's not like you have rent, but there's also these hidden fees that you weren't accounting for as a tenant, right? The next has to do with moving in inspections and moving out inspections. So here, we've modified the language in our initial inspection provision of our residential lease to specify that a tenant is entitled to a move-in inspection if they request one. So you can come in with your landlord and inspect the premises prior to moving in so that both you and the owner are on the same page about the condition of the property before you move into it. Similarly, there's a move-out inspection where we had to modify our language to comply with the requirements of the new statute as amended. And that similarly just specifies that upon moving out, an owner can also request that the owner conduct a move-out inspection and that both parties are on the same page about the condition of the property when somebody's moving out.
That's a cover your butt kind of thing on both ends.
Yes, it is.
I've been a tenant. I know that.
Me too. The next change is going to be a change to our residential lease on the utilities section. There, we've added the word "or" to make it clear that utilities can be paid by the owner or the tenant, or the utilities can be paid in part by the owner and in part by tenant.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And lastly, the inspection of the premises and right of entry section was modified in a residential lease. And these sections now provide that a landlord has to provide at least 24 hours notice to the tenant prior to entering. Now, the tenant can also permit the landlord to come in earlier or later if they agree, and that a landlord can only enter between the hours of 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. unless the parties agree otherwise. So that's a new statutory change that sets a specific time frame where a landlord can enter the premises.
Oh, that's nice.
And that'll be it. That'll be all the changes.
Are there commercial lease changes as well?
No, we actually don't even offer. We used to offer a commercial lease, but ultimately the forms committee decided that commercial leases were too nuanced and specific to the particular transaction, that creating a standalone form was just too problematic. So they discontinued that as a form.
Okay.
Now, similarly, along the same lines of the residential lease, the following change I'll discuss here in a moment also is going to apply to the seller's rent-back agreement and to the buyer's move-in agreement. And that'll be right here in the city of St. Paul. We used to have a just cause notice. That was repealed. So Chapter 193 of the Legislative Code is commonly referred to as the Safe Housing Tenant Protection Ordinance was repealed. And so we've removed that just cause notice from any of our forms that used to provide it.
Okay.
Our addendum to the commercial purchase agreement, this will be conventional SBA, other mortgage financing addendum, was changed to include that word "or" again, to specify that it's an either-or choice when you're talking about obtaining the financing or providing a written statement. So we just did that for consistency with the residential side. And lastly, as I had mentioned earlier, we created the addendum or amendment to the listing contract or buyer representation contract, and that's a form that our members can just check what purpose the form is going to serve and use that as kind of a catch-all.
Nice. So really some small changes, words here and there for clarity's sake. So really when we say 15 forms, only because there's, 3 of a purchase agreement.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it wasn't really, not a whole lot of changes.
Not a whole lot of changes, more of a refinement, I would say, this year, because substantial changes, came through last year, especially the written statement provision.
Right.
So I think the Forms Committee was also wanting to give those changes some room to grow and to breathe and to see how they're playing out in the field. And so here this year, it's just further refinement. And then, most of the changes were the result of the legislature saying you need to make these changes.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm hearing. So the majority of them were legislation sort of catalysts. Maybe the addendum was more of the realtor practice.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Do we see often, you mentioned that members can kind of suggest some changes. And so you kind of gather all of those and it's discussed. Is it common for something to be changed every year that was more a catalyst of the member versus legislation?
That's a good question. It really depends. Ultimately, if a change was made one year, it is very likely that change will not be revisited the following year, unless it's shown that the change is either problematic or causing too many issues and is not serving the purpose it was intended to serve. But by and large, the change is going to, if it was just made, the committee's going to give it some time to see how it's going to see how it plays out. Now, when it comes to which changes come through and which changes don't, if there are multiple members that we're getting the same request and we're seeing the same issue over and over again, that's usually a good signal. And this is the information I would bring to those in charge of the Forms Committee for that year, right? Whoever the chair is and the past chair will get together if we're seeing this request over and over and over again, we should pay really close attention to this. Now, whenever we get a change, we've also got to balance the change against the principle that we tend to not use our forms as an education vehicle or tool.
Okay.
Right. So sometimes a member is submitting a change and they, for better or for worse, may not understand how the form is supposed to be used, or there may be some confusion, and that the issue that's being raised really is better resolved through additional education rather than changing the form.
Right.
Right. So we're always cognizant of that. We don't want to use our forms in that way, right? Because they're not for education. Education's for education.
Yes.
But there are times when we will see, this is why I always encourage our members to, if they think that there's a better way or an easier solution or an issue that should be addressed by our forms that's not being addressed, submit those requests. The more we have, the better. Because if our members aren't doing it, where else are we going to get the feedback we need to improve our transactions?
From the everyday users.
Absolutely.
Yep. Have you heard, just out of curiosity's sake, really? So obviously we're on the east side, so we have a lot of members that are dual licensed with Wisconsin. Do you get a lot of maybe suggestions of, can you make it more like?
Yes, we do. And the answer there is we're Minnesota.
Yep, exactly.
We're not Wisconsin. But again, if another state doesn't have to be Wisconsin, it could be anywhere.
Anywhere.
If somebody's coming from somewhere else with a perspective that could improve our business practices, absolutely, right?
Yeah.
Like, let us know.
Yep.
And the Forms Committee is always trying to improve and improve and improve and refine. And so, like I said, the wider a net we can collect feedback from, the better. Now, I'm partial to Minnesota. I like to think that we do things right, but maybe I'm biased.
I only ask because I know I've heard a few times in different classes of, and I can't even think of an exact example now, but I have heard a few times of, that's one thing that I like about Wisconsin forms is, this statement, or this is, you just fill in this date and it's so much more clear, or, whatever the example is.
Totally.
Yeah. So just curious.
And the other thing to keep in mind, though, is I think one point I'd suggest to just kind of push back against that thinking a little bit is oftentimes, the form has been developed in concert with statutory requirements, right? So there's a whole lot of behind the scenes as to the why the form looks the way it does.
Oh.
And it's not always because it's a convenient business practice. It could be because there are certain requirements.
Yeah.
Disclosures, for example, are a great example, right? Why do we talk about airport zoning and meth production and, septic and all those sorts of things? Because they're mandated, right? And so a lot of the law informs the content of our forms. And while it may not always feel like it's the most efficient, right, there may nevertheless be reasons behind the scenes that require certain.
And our laws are different than Wisconsin.
Exactly, right? Exactly.
We don't both have the exact same.
Exactly.
Well, so do you have anything else to share with us in regards to forms that you want members know or educate them on?
No, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Our Forms Committee is hugely important, and the deadline to apply for our forms is going to be approaching. So the application process ends in September. We'll be sending out a formal notice from the state association to our members about an invitation to apply.
Okay.
I would encourage anyone who has an interest and is a nerd like me in forms to apply.
Do you have to have been a realtor for so many years, or?
So unlike some of our other committees, the Form Committee does tend to put some weight on the number of years you've been in the business, only because we want those
Using
on
the
our
forms.
committee who have significant experience with the forms themselves, right? And that just takes time. It's not to say that we're not always looking for new perspectives and new candidates to come on and let us know how they do things and what's working. But at the end of the day, more weight is placed on the amount of time that they've had with our forms, because that's the kind of feedback where somebody has to have a deep knowledge of the forms to be able to talk through anticipating issues understanding why something is difficult or problematic. That comes with experience, but it's a really fun committee, and it's so important because, as I mentioned earlier, the forms really are a manifestation of a transaction. It is what realtors do on paper,
Yes.
and it is one of the serious values that realtors bring to their clients is understanding what these forms are and what they work, and through all the education that they can provide. And so please apply if you've got any interest, because it's just so important.
And just to recap, so it's a quite large committee
Yes,
from all over Minnesota.
All over.
Not just the Twin Cities.
correct.
So our jurisdiction in particular goes as far north as Pine County, as far south as Goodhue County. So Mille Lacs, Anoka, all the way to the river.
Totally.
Everybody, welcome. Big broker, small broker, doesn't matter. Leave
Both.
your broker at home.
We want both, exactly.
We're talking state forms here.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yep.
Absolutely.
All right. Great. Okay. So, and deadline's coming. So
Deadline's coming in
All right.
September.
Wonderful.
right.
Anything else for us?
That's all I've got.
Well, this has been very enlightening. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
So much.
Thanks for having me.
I think our members, our brokers, will truly appreciate the intel that you've
Great.
shared. So thank you so much, and we will invite you back for
Please do.
some ethics discussion.
Sounds great.
Great.
Alrighty.
Thanks.
Thank you.